It's been confirmed that some 2022 GCSE exams will have some optional topics. In this video, I'll be telling you which subjects these are in, and in these subjects, which topics are going to be mandatory and which topics are going to be optional for AQA, Edexcel, and OCR. Let's get into it. So the first question that we need to answer is which subjects have optional topics? Now I'm aware that in a normal year, some subjects may have optional aspects of the exam, but what I'm talking about here is subjects that have specifically changed for 2022 exams due to lost learning. Now the 2022 GCSE subjects that have these new optional aspects are English Literature, History, Ancient History, and Geography. Remember, these are only the subjects that have made changes to exam assessment. Some other subjects have made changes to non-exam assessment, and I've covered these in a previous video which I will link here. Now let's take a look at which topics are optional by subject and by exam board. We'll start off briefly with Ancient History, as this is only offered by OCR, where students taking GCSE Ancient History will be examined on both period studies and one depth study. Now moving on to English Literature is where we start to see a small change in the options that you have depending on the exam board that you're using and sitting in the exam. For AQA, the mandatory topics are Shakespeare and unseen poetry, and the optional topics, where you have to choose 2 out of the 3, from anthology of poetry, a 19th century novel, or a modern drama. Now for Pearson Edexcel, the 2 mandatory topics are Shakespeare and post-1914 literature. And for the optional topics, you'll have a choice of 1 out of 2 between the 19th century novel and poetry. And finally for OCR, the mandatory topic is Shakespeare, and you'll then have to choose 2 out of the remaining 3 areas, which will be a choice of poetry, a 19th century novel, or a fiction or drama from the British Isles from 1914. Now, as you can see, for all these exam boards, they offer you an option for topics, but in a marginally different way. So make a note of what will be mandatory and what will be optional for your own exam board. Now let's take a look at the mandatory and optional topics for GCSE History. Starting with AQA, the mandatory study that you have to take is the Wider World Depth Study, and you will then be assessed on 2 of the remaining 3 optional studies, with these studies being the Period Study, the Thematic Study, and the British Depth Study with the Historic Environment. Moving on to Edexcel, which is very similar to AQA, the Modern Depth Study will be mandatory, with you then choosing from 2 of the remaining 3 studies, which are Thematic Study with Historic Environment, the British Depth Study, and the Period Study. Now moving on to OCR, the mandatory topic that you have to take is the Period Study, also known as International Relations. Similar to Edexcel and AQA, you will then be studied on the remaining 2 of 3 studies, where you will choose between the non-British Depth Study, the Thematic Study, and the British Depth Study and study of a historic environment. So for all 3 exam boards, you will effectively have to take 3 of the normal 4 studies, which effectively means you only have to sit 75% of the normal GCSE content. Now let's move on to the mandatory and optional topics for GCSE Geography, starting with AQA. The mandatory AQA topic for your exams will be urban issues, and you will then have to choose 1 out of the changing economic world or the challenge of resource management. Now for Edexcel, geography is split into either A or B, so make sure you know which of these you are. So for Edexcel Geography A, the 2 mandatory topics are the physical environment and changing cities, and you will then have to choose 1 out of global development or resource management. For Edexcel Geography B, the 2 mandatory topics are UK geographical issues and hazardous earth, and you will then choose 1 out of development dynamics or challenges of an urbanizing world. And then for OCR, it's a little bit more complicated, but I will show the optional and mandatory topics here, both for Geography A and Geography B for OCR. Now, if you have any questions about any of this, feel free to drop them in the comments. And if you found any of this video useful, I'd appreciate it if you'd consider subscribing. Thank you.